For decades, international cinema audiences looked at Deborah Kerr and believed they were witnessing the ultimate manifestation of natural aristocratic poise. She moved across the silver screen with a fluid, unbroken grace that suggested she had been born into a world of quiet drawing rooms and refined manners. Hollywood studio executives quickly recognized this quality and capitalized on it, transforming her natural elegance into a highly marketable commodity that defined her public persona for a generation. Yet, beneath that carefully applied veneer of upper-class British restraint, there lived an actress of fierce determination and unexpected psychological depth. The image projected by the major studios was a beautifully constructed illusion, a gilded cage that Kerr spent a significant portion of her creative life trying to dismantle. Years after her departure from the spotlight, her family members and closest confidants began to share stories that paint a remarkably different picture of her internal world. When you begin to examine these intimate recollections alongside her actual career choices, the legendary actress transforms from a passive symbol of high society into a complex modern woman who constantly battled the very machinery that made her famous. Her journey through the golden age of cinema was not a peaceful march of effortless success, but rather a calculated, quiet rebellion against the suffocating expectations of a highly demanding and deeply patriarchal entertainment industry. The meticulous precision that defined her cinematic performances did not materialize by chance, nor was it merely a product of Hollywood lighting and clever direction. Long before she ever set foot on an American film set, young Deborah was subjected to the grueling, uncompromising world of classical ballet training at Sadler's Wells. This intense environment demanded absolute physical mastery, where every single finger placement, head tilt, and spinal alignment had to be executed with flawless accuracy under immense psychological pressure. This rigorous early discipline permanently etched itself into her musculature, dictating the unique way she walked, stood, and breathed in front of a camera for the rest of her life. When she eventually transitioned from the demanding physical geometry of dance to the expressive world of the legitimate theater, she carried that profound physical awareness with her. On stage, she discovered that true dramatic power often lay not in grand, theatrical gestures, but in the absolute stillness between movements. This background gave her an extraordinary advantage when she finally moved toward the medium of motion pictures, an art form that inherently magnifies the slightest facial twitch or physical hesitation. While other starlets relied on erratic instinct or dramatic hyperbole to convey emotion, Kerr approached her early film roles with the calculating mindset of a classical performer who understood exactly how to project complex internal states through subtle physical control. When British film critics first encountered her in early 1940s productions like Major Barbara and Love on the Dole, they immediately recognized an anomalous screen presence. She was not merely reciting the dialogue provided by the screenwriters. She was actively sculpting the empty spaces around the words, utilizing deliberate pauses to suggest a deeply active intellectual life. This unique ability to convey profound internal monologue without speaking a single line allowed her characters to feel extraordinarily alive, bridging the gap between the audience and the screen. As she integrated herself deeper into the fabric of wartime British cinema, this distinctive acting methodology became increasingly sophisticated and mesmerizing. By the time she appeared in Michael Powell and Emeric Pressburger's masterpiece, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, she was demonstrating a rare chameleon-like versatility that completely captivated contemporary audiences. In that singular, structurally complex film, she portrayed three entirely distinct women across different historical eras, infusing each character with a specific, individualized dignity that prevented them from becoming mere caricatures. She possessed an uncanny, almost paradoxical ability to appear completely accessible to the average viewer, while simultaneously maintaining a mysterious, aristocratic distance. This subtle duality made her an incredibly valuable asset in a frantic industry that regularly favored loud, overt theatricality over quiet, psychological realism, establishing her as a performer of rare and undeniable cinematic distinction. Instead of relying on emotional exaggeration or histrionic outbursts to command the frame, she anchored her earliest cinematic triumphs in an unwavering emotional economy. Directors quickly realized that they could trust her with highly sensitive, complex thematic material, because she possessed the rare ability to suggest immense emotional devastation without ever raising her voice. Audiences around the world responded powerfully to this pervasive sense of structural restraint, finding a deep, comforting realism in her portrayals of women facing extraordinary circumstances with quiet dignity. However, this very artistic strength, which initially elevated her above her contemporary peers, quickly began to serve as a restrictive creative cage. Producers and studio heads, inherently risk-averse and eager to repeat successful financial formulas, began casting her exclusively as women of unyielding moral fortitude and emotional containment. She found herself repeatedly trapped in scripts where her primary narrative function was to embody an unwavering beacon of virtue while the world around her fell into chaotic ruin. This repetitive typecasting began to feel less like a celebration of her specific acting talents and more like an intentional limitation of her artistic expressive range. The industry had decided who Deborah Kerr was supposed to be on screen, and they showed very little interest in exploring the darker, more volatile creative currents that she knew she was fully capable of channeling. When Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer offered her a lucrative contract and brought her to the glittering world of Hollywood, this restrictive casting philosophy was magnified to an unprecedented degree. The classical studio system of old Hollywood operated like a highly efficient factory, relying heavily on immediate audience recognition and rigid character archetypes to maximize global box office profits. Upon her arrival in California, the studio's publicity department immediately positioned her as the quintessential English gentlewoman, an emblem of sophisticated elegance, immaculate diction, and unshakable emotional control. At the beginning of this glamorous transatlantic transition, the strategic positioning felt like a perfectly natural, highly prestigious extension of the celebrated work she had already accomplished in the United Kingdom. Massive commercial projects like The Hucksters, which paired her with legendary leading men, and sweeping adventure epics like King Solomon's Mines, vastly expanded her visibility to a global audience. These were undeniably massive, high-profile studio endeavors that firmly cemented her position as an elite, Tier 1 international movie star. Yet beneath the immense fame and the glittering jewel-toned costumes, the actual characters she was assigned to play rarely offered any genuine artistic challenges. She was celebrated globally for being consistent, reliable, and impeccably dignified, but she was simultaneously being denied the vital creative oxygen required to truly shift her artistic direction. This specific period in her professional trajectory marks the definitive moment where a profound cultural misunderstanding took firm root in the public consciousness. To the casual moviegoer looking in from the outside, it appeared as though Deborah Kerr had achieved a flawless, enviable alignment between her natural gifts and the Hollywood machine. The cinematic output looked completely seamless, the critical reviews were routinely glowing, her box office reliability was unquestioned, and her international prestige grew with each passing year. Internally, however, the daily psychological experience of maintaining this immaculate facade was becoming increasingly exhausting and creatively unfulfilling. The profound physical and mental discipline that had once granted her immense creative freedom as a young stage actress was now being weaponized by the studio system to confine her. The more effectively and beautifully she embodied the impossible standards of elegance expected of her, the more difficult it became to secure roles that possessed genuine human grit. What the adoring global public perceived as an admirable display of artistic consistency, Kerr was privately beginning to experience as a suffocating, soul-crushing creative limitation. She found herself trapped in an ironclad paradox where her extraordinary talent for subtlety had effectively rendered her invisible as a multifaceted, emotionally volatile human being. This brewing sense of quiet professional frustration did not manifest as an immediate, explosive public tantrum or an impulsive breach of her lucrative studio contract. Kerr was an exceptionally intelligent, highly strategic professional who harbored a deep respect for the craft of filmmaking and the realities of commercial cinema. Instead of burning bridges, her desire for artistic liberation developed gradually, carefully fueled by years of observation and a growing intolerance for creative monotony. She understood the intricate mechanics of the corporate studio system she inhabited, and she knew exactly how to play their game better than almost anyone else on the lot. But she also possessed the clarity of mind to recognize that her immense commercial success was extracting a devastating toll on her personal artistic growth. The rigid system was systematically eroding the extensive emotional range she had spent decades cultivating through grueling theater work, reducing her complex identity to a two-dimensional caricature of British politeness. This sharp, internal realization was not something she could comfortably ignore or suppress forever, and she quietly began waiting for the exact right moment to strike. She knew that if she wanted to change the trajectory of her creative life, she would have to orchestrate an artistic coup that the studio bosses would never see coming. The definitive turning point of her career did not arrive through a series of polite negotiations or a gradual shift in studio policy, but rather through a single, high-stakes gamble. When the opportunity arose to portray the character of Karen Holmes in Fred Zinnemann's gritty wartime drama From Here to Eternity, Kerr recognized it as her ultimate escape hatch. Up to that point, she had spent years building a multi-million-dollar reputation as a safe, highly marketable symbol of moral purity and aristocratic restraint. Accepting a highly controversial role centered entirely around an abusive, deeply unhappy marriage and a fiercely passionate, adulterous affair was an act of extreme professional defiance. It was not merely an unconventional character choice. It was a direct, calculated assault on the very foundations of her meticulously constructed Hollywood identity. At this critical juncture, she made a bold tactical move that very few contract actors of that era would have ever dared to attempt by actively demanding the role. She deliberately risked her financial security, her immense industry standing, and her pristine public reputation to force the world to see her true capabilities. What made this historic decision so profoundly significant was the absolute intentionality and sharp self-awareness that guided her through the entire tumultuous casting process. Kerr was acutely aware of how thoroughly the public had been conditioned to perceive her as an icy, untouchable English lady, and she harbored a quiet disdain for that limiting worldview. Taking on the emotionally raw and physically uninhibited role of Karen Holmes allowed her to violently shatter that artificial glass display case once and for all. The character was a deeply wounded, sexually frustrated, and emotionally complex woman who actively engaged in a dangerous romance that flew directly in the face of conservative societal expectations. The now legendary beach scene, featuring Kerr and Burt Lancaster embracing amidst the crashing ocean surf, instantly became one of the most culturally iconic and shocking moments in cinematic history. It did not achieve this status simply because of its overt physical intimacy, but because it instantly destroyed the long-held public illusion that Kerr could only exist within the boundaries of polite society. The massive creative risk paid off in a spectacular fashion that completely redefined the entire landscape of her subsequent Hollywood career. The film went on to become one of the highest-grossing and most critically acclaimed productions of the entire decade, earning her another prestigious Academy Award nomination. More importantly, it completely altered how top-tier directors and cynical studio executives viewed her dramatic potential, opening doors that had previously been firmly bolted shut. She was no longer viewed as merely a composed, decorative figure to be placed at the center of polite period dramas. She had definitively proven she could carry immense emotional intensity. She possessed the unique capability to project deep human contradiction, raw desperation, and fierce sexuality without ever losing the immaculate structural discipline that defined her core acting methodology. This mesmerizing combination of external control and internal volatility made her far more compelling than any one-dimensional archetype Hollywood could have ever invented. However, even this monumental artistic breakthrough did not completely grant her absolute, unrestricted freedom from the deeply entrenched biases of the studio system. In the highly profitable years that closely followed this triumph, she found herself constantly forced to navigate a delicate balance between industry expectations and her own desire for exploration. Landmark films like The King and I and An Affair to Remember reinforced her status as an elite box office draw, but they also continuously pulled her back toward familiar territory. What had truly transformed, however, was not the commercial system surrounding her, but her own internal psychological awareness of her power within that system. She had experienced firsthand the extraordinary artistic liberation that existed outside the artificial boundaries of her public image, and that knowledge guided every career decision she made moving forward. Part 2. Long before she ever shocked the world by rolling in the Hawaiian surf-in From Here to Eternity, there were already subtle, fascinating clues hidden within her earlier work. One of the absolute most profound and visually stunning examples of this hidden psychological complexity can be found in her performance in the 1947 psychological drama Black Narcissus. Directed by the visionary filmmaking duo of Powell and Pressburger, the film appeared on its surface to be a straightforward, deeply respectful story about religious devotion and isolation. Set against the breathtaking, vertigo-inducing backdrop of a remote, windswept Himalayan palace, the narrative followed a small group of Anglican nuns trying to establish a convent. Kerr's character, Sister Clodagh, was introduced as a woman of supreme organizational discipline, rigid emotional control, and absolute commitment to her spiritual duty. But as the foreign environment began to exert its strange psychological influence, that pristine composure began to fracture in incredibly subtle, deeply unsettling ways. What made her performance so extraordinary was not what she chose to show the audience, but rather what she masterfully chose to withhold. There was a constant, almost palpable undercurrent of intense psychological and emotional tension running directly beneath her immaculate white habit, tied closely to themes of memory and repressed desire. Sister Clodagh was not merely struggling against the harsh physical elements and the cultural isolation of her new mountain home. She was actively waging an agonizing war against her own suppressed past. The exotic, highly sensual atmosphere of the palace, combined with the constant, mocking wind, systematically stripped away her carefully constructed psychological defenses, dragging her hidden vulnerabilities to the surface. While the film's script avoided any explicit depictions of sensuality, the intense psychological tension generated by Kerr's performance was absolutely unmistakable to anyone watching closely. At the time of its initial worldwide release, this deeply suggestive, highly experimental aspect of the film sparked immense controversy, particularly within the conservative cultural landscape of the United States. Catholic censorship boards and nervous distribution executives raised fierce objections to how these supposedly holy, untouchable religious figures were being portrayed on screen. Several key sequence cuts were demanded, not because the images themselves were inherently indecent, but because the psychological implications of Kerr's acting were deemed too dangerous for mass consumption. Decades later, legendary filmmakers like Martin Scorsese would look back at this film and openly celebrate it as a supreme masterpiece of visual eroticism. This modern critical reinterpretation completely reframed Kerr's early performance, showing that what was once dismissed as simple British restraint was actually a deeply layered study in human repression. This specific, highly charged cinematic era is precisely where the earliest whisperings and persistent industry rumors regarding Deborah Kerr's hidden depths began to take shape. Astute filmgoers always instinctively sensed that there was a massive, unexplored universe of emotion hiding just behind her cool, clear eyes, even if contemporary society lacked the vocabulary to articulate it. Years later, when a bold new television adaptation of Black Narcissus was being produced for a modern audience, her daughter, Francesca Shrapnel, made a deeply revealing public statement. She noted that her late mother would have been absolutely fascinated and delighted by the modern, overt interpretation of the story's inherent sensuality. This single intimate insight from her own flesh and blood confirmed what many radical film historians had long suspected about Kerr's artistic intellect. It strongly suggested that Kerr herself had always been fully aware of the dark, adult themes she was weaving into her performances, even when working under strict censorship. The fascinating contradictions that audiences once whispered about in the dark were not a figment of their imagination, they were consciously placed there by a master actress. As her career marched steadily forward into the golden era of the 1950s, the sharp contrast between her immaculate public image and her actual private reality grew impossible to ignore. While she continued to effortlessly project an image of absolute control on theater screens worldwide, her private life was being heavily buffeted by intense personal pressures. Her first marriage to the highly decorated World War II fighter ace Anthony Bartley began amidst the chaotic, romantic intensity of the final war years. It was a time when her professional career was suddenly accelerating at a blinding, dizzying pace, shifting her focus away from domestic life. What followed behind closed doors was a complex, painful domestic dynamic that quietly and systematically deteriorated over several agonizing years. As her Hollywood star rose higher and higher, the economic and social imbalance between the couple grew into a vast, unbridgeable chasm. She was suddenly earning an astronomical income, traveling across the globe for massive film shoots, and receiving the breathless adoration of millions of international fans. Meanwhile, her husband remained anchored in a traditional, stagnant post-war reality that did not evolve or expand to accommodate his wife's extraordinary global success. According to private letters and later family accounts, this massive disparity generated an unbearable amount of domestic tension, fueled by a deep, unspoken resentment toward her independence. This painful marital strain was not an overnight disaster, nor did it manifest as a series of loud, scandalous public scenes for the aggressive tabloid press to exploit. Instead, the relationship quietly bled to death over a period of years, heavily exacerbated by prolonged professional separations and the ceaseless, exhausting demands of her career. By the time the couple finally and inevitably finalized their quiet divorce, the comforting public myth of the perfectly stable, domestic Englishwoman had been completely contradicted by her lived reality. This difficult period served as the first definitive, undeniable proof of the vast, echoing gulf that existed between the manufactured movie star and the real woman. Her subsequent marriage to the highly intellectual, deeply progressive screenwriter Peter Viertel brought an entirely different, much-needed form of emotional stability to her life. But this second grand romance also marked a profound, highly intentional turning point in the exact way she chose to interact with the world. Around this specific time, the entire landscape of corporate Hollywood was undergoing a massive, highly turbulent cultural transformation that she found deeply unappealing. American cinema was rapidly becoming significantly more explicit, increasingly fixated on graphic violence, and heavily reliant on shocking physical exposure to attract younger audiences. Rather than compromising her artistic standards or desperately shifting her performance style to fit these new, hypersexualized industry trends, she made a quiet, definitive choice to walk away. She began spending a significant portion of her time in the pristine, isolated mountains of Switzerland, choosing a quiet, deeply private existence far removed from California. This monumental decision to retreat from the epicenter of global cinema has frequently been misinterpreted by lazy historians as a sad, forced retirement driven by a lack of offers. In reality, her departure from the Hollywood stage was an incredibly deliberate, highly empowered act of personal autonomy by a woman who had nothing left to prove. She had already conquered the highest peaks of global fame, successfully challenged the most powerful studio bosses of her era, and definitively demonstrated her unmatched dramatic range. Her subsequent lifestyle choices were not dictated by professional desperation or dwindling box office relevance, but by a pure, unadulterated preference for personal peace and intellectual privacy. Her daughter later emphasized that Kerr was, at her absolute core, a naturally introverted, deeply private human being who viewed fame as a strange job. She was a woman who had spent decades meticulously managing and tolerating the suffocating spotlight, rather than genuinely embracing or needing its validation. By the time a new generation of film lovers began to enthusiastically rediscover her classic body of work in the early 1990s, she was living an idyllic existence. Iconic films like Sleepless in Seattle, which utilized her classic romance and affair to remember as a major emotional plot point, sparked a massive wave of nostalgia. This sudden unexpected resurgence of global interest could easily have been used to launch a highly lucrative late-career comeback tour in the media. Yet this intense wave of renewed adoration did not pull her back even an inch into the frantic, transactional world of the entertainment industry. Instead, this late-career cultural phenomenon highlighted something far more profound about the enduring, timeless nature of her specific cinematic legacy. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that her extraordinary screen performances possessed a permanent, indestructible artistic value that transcended the decades. She had successfully managed to outlive the very studio system that had tried so hard to commodify and control her unique talent. In her quiet, unwavering refusal to feed the insatiable celebrity media machine, the true essence of who she actually was became beautifully apparent to the world. She was not a fragile, manufactured studio doll. She was a self-determined artist who had reclaimed absolute ownership of her own life. During the final, peaceful twilight years of her long life, the immense distance between her public myth and her private reality ceased to be a secret. She had completely cut the remaining strings that tied her to the modern entertainment industry, choosing instead a quiet life centered around deep family connections. When she did occasionally choose to bless the screen with her presence during this final era, it was always entirely on her own strict, uncompromised terms. Her rare appearances in high-quality television miniseries, such as the wildly popular adaptation of A Woman of Substance, felt deeply significant and intentional. In these final roles, she did not attempt to recapture the youthful, romantic elegance that had initially made her a household name across the globe. Instead, she masterfully portrayed wealthy matriarchs, projecting a profound sense of accumulated life experience, unshakable moral authority, and sharp intellectual wisdom. This late-career artistic transition was not loud or dramatic, but it carried an immense amount of weight for those who had followed her journey. It demonstrated with absolute clarity that she had completely transcended the desperate need to conform to anyone else's expectations of how an actress should age. She was fully focused on executing work that she found personally meaningful, using her talent as a pure form of self-expression rather than a career tool. Part 3. When she finally slipped away peacefully at the advanced age of 86, the mainstream international media response was swift, respectful, and highly predictable. Major newspapers and television networks across the globe focused almost exclusively on compiling extensive lists of her legendary professional accolades. They spoke at great length about her historic 6 Academy Award nominations for Best Actress, her honorary Oscar, and her decades of influential work. But the quiet, deeply poetic events that closely followed her passing added an overwhelming layer of emotional gravity that captured the public imagination. Just 3 short weeks after Deborah drew her final breath, her beloved husband of nearly 5 decades, Peter Viertel, also passed away in Europe. This sudden dual departure brought a profound, deeply romantic sense of cosmic finality to their shared narrative, capturing the hearts of romantic film fans everywhere. It was a quiet, remarkably dignified ending that lacked any form of modern Hollywood spectacle or media exploitation, perfectly mirroring her lifestyle. It was only after both partners had exited the grand stage of life that the fuller, truer picture of Deborah Kerr began to emerge. Through a series of incredibly thoughtful, deeply reflective retrospective interviews, Francesca Shrapnel began the delicate process of dismantling her mother's icy public myth. She painted a vivid portrait of a woman who possessed a wicked, self-deprecating sense of humor that was completely hidden from her film audiences. She spoke candidly about her mother's lifelong discomfort with being shoved into a clean, bloodless box of polite British respectability by lazy casting directors. Francesca revealed that her mother was a deeply analytical thinker who was constantly searching for the hidden psychological flaws and dark impulses in her characters. These intimate family reflections were not intended to be shocking, tabloid-style revelations or scandalous exposes of hidden Hollywood misbehavior. Instead, they served to validate and confirm what the most perceptive film critics and dedicated fans had quietly suspected for over half a century. The breathtaking elegance that the world had admired for decades was not a fake persona, but it was merely the outermost layer of a multifaceted soul. Looking back at her monumental career through this modern, highly nuanced lens, it becomes abundantly clear that the old industry rumors were mischaracterized. They were never actually about secret scandals or hidden infidelities. They were about a profound, systemic cultural contradiction. The persistent rumors were born from a collective, intuitive understanding that this extraordinary actress was being actively suppressed by the narrow imagination of her era. Audiences could feel the immense, vibrating tension generated by a brilliant woman trying to express complex human truths within a highly sanitized cinematic landscape. The fascinating idea that she had walked away from the glittering heights of Hollywood purely by choice, rather than due to professional decline, was fully vindicated. All of these long-held fan theories and historical assumptions have been thoroughly supported by the beautiful, intimate details that emerged after her death. These insights did not come through dramatic, trashy tell-all memoirs, but through consistent, dignified accounts that perfectly align with her artistic spirit. Therefore, when we look back at the cinematic legacy of Deborah Kerr today, we are forced to confront a fascinating intellectual choice. Do we choose to remember the immaculate, bloodless monument to British politeness that the old Hollywood studio system spent millions of dollars creating? Or do we choose to celebrate the fierce, highly independent, and deeply complex artist who spent her entire life quietly fighting for her freedom? The true value of her artistic journey lies precisely in her inspiring ability to maintain her personal integrity while operating inside a highly destructive industry. She refused to allow her soul to be entirely consumed by the monstrous celebrity apparatus, maintaining a secret, sacred space for her true self. Her life stands as a brilliant, shining blueprint for modern performers navigating the treacherous waters of global fame and artificial public branding. She proved that it is entirely possible to play the Hollywood game at the absolute highest level without losing your humanity in the process. As modern film scholarship continues to evolve and look past the glossy surface of old studio publicity campaigns, her stock continues to rise. We are finally beginning to appreciate the immense courage it took for a contract actress in the 1950s to stand up and demand her artistic freedom. Her quiet rebellion did not just save her own creative life, it helped pave the way for future generations of actresses to demand complex roles. She shattered the archaic notion that a woman on screen had to be either an untouchable saint or a disposable sinner. By showing the world that an elegant lady could also possess raw passion, deep psychological wounds, and fierce independence, she changed the language of cinema. Her enduring film performances continue to speak directly to us across the decades, precisely because they are anchored in genuine human truth. The superficial glamour of old Hollywood has long since faded into the dusty pages of history books, but her art remains completely alive. When we watch her today, we are no longer blinded by the old studio publicity machine that insisted on her perfection. Instead, we can finally appreciate the subtle craft, the hidden depths, and the fierce intelligence of a truly remarkable woman. She was an actress who successfully managed to turn restraint into a high art form, using silence as a powerful creative weapon. Deborah Kerr was never just the immaculate English gentlewoman that the world thought it knew so well. She was a true master of her craft. Her real story is a beautiful reminder that the most fascinating human landscapes are often those that lie hidden beneath a calm surface.